In this session, we move into Chapter 6 of Superbloom, How Technologies of Connection Tear Us Apart by Nicholas Carr. Chapter 6 is titled The Democratization Fallacy. Medium of the masses. So, 1. Content collapses as analog media's regulatory regime and epistemic architecture give way to digitization's totalizing advance. 2. Media technology extends beyond its traditional transport function to assume an editorial role, automating judgments about the relevance and quality of information. 3. People streamline their writing and reading to optimize their efficiency as transceivers of messages on a high-speed communication network. 4. Social media encourages unchecked self-expression, greatly expanding the platform's supply of content but producing feelings of envy, enmity, and claustrophobia among individuals. The four forces, intertwined and mutually reinforcing, all springing from a new mechanism of communication, go a long way toward explaining the social and political problems produced by digital media. But as they played out over the past few decades, they went largely unnoticed. They didn't fit the story we were telling ourselves about the internet and the information age. When John Paul Stevens wrote the Supreme Court's opinion in the Carlin case, he and his fellow justices had a clear conception of what mass media looked like and how it operated within society, a conception the public would have shared. Mass media had, after all, been around for decades, centuries in the case of publishing, and its operational and cultural characteristics were well established. Media, in the United States and many other parts of the world, operated as an industry, with a clear divide between the supply side and the demand side. Broadcasting and publishing were largely in the hands of a small group of for-profit companies that controlled the creation and distribution of content. The public played the role of consumers, selecting what to read, watch, and listen to from the limited set of options that professional writers, editors, and producers served up. Because TV and radio stations controlled the supply of broadcast content, and through the one-to-many model enjoyed direct access to people's homes, it was generally agreed that the government needed to monitor the broadcasting industry to protect the public interest. The FCC acted as a kind of consumer protection agency in the information marketplace, keeping tabs on the shows broadcast by the networks to ensure media companies didn't abuse their power or infringe on the well-being of individuals and families. The Commission, as Stevens argued, wasn't censoring speech when it censured WBAI for airing Carlin's filthy words in the middle of the day. It was just doing its job of preventing potentially offensive content from sneaking uninvited into people's homes or cars. Those who wanted to hear Carlin's routine were free to buy his records or attend his performances or watch one of his cable specials on HBO. 20 years later, when Stevens again took up his pen, this time to write the court's decision in the 1997 Reno v. ACLU case, neither the justices nor anyone else had a clear idea what the internet was or would become. The first web browsers were just a few years old, and only about 50 million people were regularly spending time online, most of them connecting through business or university accounts or using private dial-up services such as AOL or CompuServe. Most of the qualities we now take for granted in online media had yet to emerge. Many weren't even imaginable. Stevens's labored attempt to describe the internet testified to its embryonic state at the time. Quote, "Anyone with access to the internet may take advantage of a wide variety of communication and information retrieval methods. These methods are constantly evolving and difficult to categorize precisely. But, as presently constituted, those most relevant to this case are electronic mail, email, automatic mailing list services, mail exploders, sometimes referred to as listservs, news groups, chat rooms, and the World Wide Web. All of these methods can be used to transmit text, Most can transmit sound, pictures, and moving video images. Taken together, these tools constitute a unique medium, known to its users as cyberspace, located in no particular geographical location, but available to anyone, anywhere in the world with access to the internet." End quote. New technological systems never arrive fully formed. They take years to mature technically, and even longer to make their full social and cultural effects known. The more complex their workings and far-reaching their uses, the longer the maturation process takes and the likelier it is to produce surprises. But people can't sit back and wait for all the uncertainties to be resolved. They have to make important decisions about the technology from the start. For those decisions to be made in an organized rather than chaotic fashion, society has to come up with a shared story about the new system and its social role. The story serves to guide business and government investment, shape public opinion and consumer behavior, and steer regulatory and legal responses. Repeated by journalists, academics, and public officials, not to mention inventors and entrepreneurs, it becomes, regardless of its accuracy, one of the crucial factors determining how the technology progresses. Even before it came into wide use, the Internet was understood to be, as Stevens wrote in his opinion, a unique and wholly new medium of worldwide human communication. It was the first true multimedia system, able to handle sound, pictures, and moving video images as well as text. Even more important, it was the first many-to-many communication network with the capacity to carry large volumes of information efficiently between any of its nodes. Cheap radio transceivers offered something of a precedent, but their use was limited by spectrum and other constraints. The story we told ourselves about the net from its earliest days was a story of democratization. The new network was opening media, in particular broadcasting, to individual citizens, and by bringing the voices of more people into public debates, it would deepen and strengthen democracy in general. The story fit the net's technical characteristics, and it reflected the public's sunny view of new communication systems. It also resonated with the times. In the wake of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall had come down only 8 years earlier. The continued spread of democracy seemed inevitable. In his widely discussed article, The End of History, published in 1989, the same year Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, Francis Fukuyama heralded the arrival of, quote, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government, end quote. The web seemed the perfect medium for the dawning age of universal democracy. The technology's effect, wrote the prominent economist editor Frances Cairncross in her 1997 book, The Death of Distance, quote, will be to increase understanding, foster tolerance, and ultimately promote worldwide peace, end quote. Her words echoed almost note for note the utopian rhetoric that had accompanied new communication systems at the century's start. The democratization story runs as a stirring refrain through Stevens's opinion. Akin to a vast library including millions of readily available and indexed publications, the net was giving everyone access to information that used to be reserved for elites. The content of the Internet, Stevens declared, is as diverse as human thought. Even more important, the new system was giving the masses the power to produce and distribute media content. Breaking down the old divide between mass media's supply side and demand side, between information production and information consumption, it was giving everyone an equal voice. Any person or organization with a computer connected to the Internet can publish information, Stevens wrote. No single organization controls any membership in the web, nor is there any single centralized point from which individual websites or services can be blocked. Any citizen can become a town crier with a voice that resonates farther than it could from any soapbox. It was obvious, he concluded, that the Internet deserves special medium-specific treatment under the law. As the most participatory form of mass speech yet developed, it should be granted he said, the highest protection from governmental intrusion. Margaret Mead's ideal of a truly democratic communication medium, bidirectional, decentralized, participatory, multisensory, enveloping, had gone underground in the 60s. Without the technology required to bring it to the masses, it lost its force as a practical social goal and, in the form of acid tests and other multimedia happenings, turned into an expression of countercultural transcendentalism, or at least hedonism. It devolved from the civic to the psychedelic, and then, like other hippie dreams, evaporated into the consumerism of the 70s and 80s. But now, thanks to the net, the ideal was suddenly back and being realized. Mass media and mass men were at last being supplanted by democratic media and democratic men. The bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2000 and 2001 dampened enthusiasm for the net as an investment opportunity, but by shifting people's focus from the medium's commercial prospects to its social possibilities, it further invigorated the public sense of the network as a new kind of democratic community, egalitarian, welcoming, open. When the World Trade Center attack late in 2001 shook people's faith in the inevitability of global democracy, the net took on an even greater symbolic importance for many of its users, becoming a repository for their hopes for the future. The stock market crash offered an opportunity for renaissance, the popular media writer Douglas Rushkoff suggested in his 2003 monograph, Open Source Democracy. In the face of tyranny, fundamentalism, and other threats to democracy and free discourse in the real world, the net's interactive technologies offer us a ray of hope for a renewed spirit of genuine civic engagement, he wrote. He suggested that in the uncorrupted sphere of cyberspace, we could teach ourselves to be better, more fully democratic citizens. Quote, the very survival of democracy as a functional reality may be dependent on our acceptance as individuals of adult roles in conceiving and stewarding the shape and direction of society, and we may get our best rehearsal for these roles online, end quote. The net would help us grow up. The post-crash arrival of Web 2.0, with its flowering of blogs, new aggregation sites, and social networks, was taken as further confirmation of the democratization narrative. The means of media are now in the hands of the people, trumpeted the then prominent journalist cum blogger Jeff Jarvis in 2004, the year of Facebook's founding and Gmail's launch. This isn't just a media revolution, though that's where we are seeing the impact first. This is a chain reaction of revolutions. It has just begun. Joe Trippi, who managed Howard Dean's populist presidential run in 2004, declared the net the most democratizing innovation we've ever seen, more so than even the printing press. The New York University journalism professor Jay Rosen, writing in the online Huffington Post, heralded a shift in power that goes with the platform shift. The masses, he called them, the masses, he called them the people formerly known as the audience, were storming the media gates and seizing the means to speak. The rhetoric may have been Marxian, but the thrust was median. Margaret Median. The Goldilocks Net. The fullest, most intellectually rigorous recital of the democratization narrative came via the law professor Yochai Benkler in his 2006 opus, The Wealth of Networks. Benkler acknowledged the debt he owed to Stevens, writing that the justice's opinion in Reno v. ACLU laid out the basic case for the democratizing effect of the Internet. But with 8 more years of experience to draw on, he pushed the case much further. Across 500 pages of dense, suitably technocratic prose, he argued that the Internet revolution was well on its way to supplanting mass media's centralized industrial information economy with a radically decentralized, networked public sphere. Spurring the epochal transformation were two developments, one technical, the other economic. Quote, the first element is the shift from a hub-and-spoke architecture with unidirectional links to the endpoints in the mass media to distributed architecture with multi-directional connections among all nodes in the networked information environment. The second is the practical elimination of communications costs as a barrier to speaking across associational boundaries. Together, these characteristics have fundamentally altered the capacity of individuals, acting alone or with others, to be active participants in the public sphere." End quote. Like Mead and her colleagues on the Committee for National Morale, Winkler assumed that changes in media structure come to be mirrored in the attitudes of citizens and, in turn, in a society's politics and culture. A freer, more democratic mechanism of communication means a freer, more democratic polity. When people adapt to the culture of participation created by the net, their self-perception changes, Winkler wrote. They become more democratic beings. The easy possibility of communicating effectively into the public sphere allows individuals to reorient themselves from passive readers and listeners to potential speakers and participants in a conversation, he wrote. Their thoughts and opinions about the daily events in their lives no longer have to remain merely private observations, but rather become potential subjects for public communication. Private lives become public concerns, content for broadcasting. The political agenda, he summed up, can be rooted in the life and experience of individual participants in society, in their observations, experiences, and obsessions. End quote. It's through this merging of the personal and the political, the private and the public, that the internet democratizes. Not everyone bought the story. At the turn of the millennium, a few doubters began to suggest that unfettered speech could breed factionalism and fanaticism. Even as it brings more voices into political debates and deliberations, the democratization of media might erode rather than extend the foundations of political liberty. In his 2001 book, Republic.com, the legal scholar Cass Sunstein warned that the net, by freely spreading information from innumerable sources, while at the same time dismantling controls on information quality, could pollute the public square with lies and misinformation, and divide the body politic into bitterly opposed camps. Guided by the well-known confirmation bias in human psychology, people would give more weight to information that, whether factual or not, supported their preconceived views while discounting contrary information. A fragmented communications market creates considerable dangers, he wrote. For individuals, constant exposure to one set of views is likely to lead to errors and confusions. And to the extent that the process entrenches existing views, spreads falsehood, promotes extremism, and makes people less able to work cooperatively on shared problems, there are dangers for society as a whole. Whatever the shortcomings of the institutional structure of mass media in the 20th century, it at least served as a check on a kind of craziness. Winkler acknowledged such fears, citing Sunstein's work in particular. He yoked them together under the label the Babel objection, which he defined, Babel, B-A-B-E-L, as in the Tower of Babel in the Bible, in the Old Testament. He yoked them together under the label the Babel objection, which he defined as the concern that information overload will lead to fragmentation of discourse, polarization, and the loss of political community. He then proceeded, quote, at the risk of appearing a chimera of Goldilocks and Pangloss, end quote, to dismiss them. Drawing on early studies of hyperlinking patterns and traffic flows among blogs and other informational websites, he argued that a new grassroots process of content review, accreditation, and filtering had emerged online. Through peer review by information affinity groups, clusters of web users who share an interest in and knowledge of a particular topic, the process weeds out falsehoods and fluff. The affinity groups he offered as an example Slashdot, a technology news aggregator that ranks stories on the basis of readers' votes. And I'm going to just add a personal note here. This word aggregator, I guess it was when Mark Wingfield called me in 2020 to ask me if I would provide the curated content for Baptist News Global, which I've been doing since then for around 6 years now. Mark's the one that told me, because he was a regular reader and follower of my Weekly Baptist Roundup that I'd been doing since 2011. He was the first one who told, well, he's the only one who ever told me that what I was doing, I was an aggregator. He said, that's the name for what I was doing. Of course, I guess now a curator. But he told me I was an aggregator. It's the first time I'd heard that word, especially in that context. But I think first time I'd heard it all. But anyway, so that's my story. The affinity groups, he offered as an example Slashdot, a technology news aggregator that ranks stories on the basis of readers' votes. Filter the observations and opinions of an enormous range of people and transmit those that pass local peer review to broader groups and ultimately to the polity more broadly, without recourse to market-based points of control over the information flow. End quote. Content is vetted from the bottom up, winnowed through layers of informal, decentralized quality control. Only the best stuff reaches the masses. And that's what I tried to do with Weekly Baptist Roundup, was to, I usually had linked to about around 100 articles every week. Read every one of them. But I tried to link to those that I felt were most relevant to my audience. I had about 800 people at our Baptist reading it every week, mostly moderate, not all. I say moderate, mostly progressive or leaning that way. Not all, but mostly. And so I tried to filter it and provide links to articles that I felt were most relevant to that audience. So that's kind of what he's talking about here. Content is vetted from the bottom up, winnowed through layers of informal, decentralized quality control. Only the best stuff reaches the masses. On the internet, in Winkler's estimation, the marketplace of ideas at last operates as a true market. Rather than being consolidated in the hands of big media companies, responsibility for content selection and quality control spreads throughout the network. And I should add that I still do that for Baptist News Global, the same type of thing. Try to filter it to where I provide content that's most relevant to Mark's audience. On the internet, in Winkler's estimation, the marketplace of ideas at last operates as a true market. Rather than being consolidated in the hands of big media companies, responsibility for content selection and quality control spreads throughout the network. The editorial function itself becomes democratized. This organic yet ordered system of cooperative filtering, he claimed, provides for a freer and more participative civic arena than did the old mass media system, and yet also avoids the generation of a din, D-I-N. The control it imposes is neither too tight, which would curtail expression, nor too loose, which would produce cacophony. Like the temperature of Goldilocks' porridge, it strikes a perfect twosome balance. Just right. Countering tendencies toward factionalism and extremism, the network allows the citizenry to join in knowledgeable, constructive, and civil discussions of contentious issues. It turns out that we are not intellectual lemmings, Winkler wrote. We do not use the freedom that the network has made possible to plunge us into the abyss of incoherent babble. This time B-A-B-B-L-E, end quote. Winkler's argument was thoughtful, logical, and wrong. Like Stevens before him, he allowed his faith in the democratization narrative to skew his perspective. The evidence he found of people using voting, linking, and commenting systems to make informed judgments about online content was real, but misleading. The peer review tools that worked on news aggregator sites such as Slashdot and in certain quarters of the then vibrant blogosphere turned out to be peripheral to the development of the so-called networked public sphere. They were of great interest to the net's geeky pioneers and their fellow travelers in media and academia, but of little interest to ordinary people. They ended up being of minor consequence to the broader flows of information and influence online. There would be a whole lot of group sharing and filtering on social media, both cooperative and combative. But it would play out in a far more anarchic and divisive way than the democratization crusaders assumed. It's telling that Binkler barely mentions social media platforms in his book. The pioneering and failing social network Friendster got a brief dismissive nod, but that was about it. Yet by 2006, MySpace and YouTube were among the 10 most visited websites in the world. Facebook's explosive growth was well underway, and a newly launched platform named Twitter was gaining notice and traffic. Like most observers at the time, Binkler didn't foresee how these popular news sites would come to position themselves as central, corporate-controlled clearinghouses of news, messages, and other content. Indeed, he assumed the net would continue to resist such corporate control. By creating sources of information and communication facilities that no one owns or exclusively controls, he concluded, the networked information economy removes some of the most basic opportunities for manipulation of those who depend on information and communication by the owners of the basic means of communications. End quote. In ignoring or downplaying trends that didn't fit the favored narrative, he seems to have been a victim of confirmation bias himself. The point here is not to pillory the professor, whose work remains essential to understanding the history of the net. It's to show the danger of assuming that the way a complex technological system works early in its development will be the way it works as it matures. And it's to show the enduring and distorting power of the public's optimistic view of communication technology, which, in the case of the net, informed the mistaken belief that a more open and efficient media would necessarily expand and strengthen democracy. These misperceptions had consequences. They prevented society from undertaking a careful, clear-eyed assessment of the risks presented by the net and subsequently social media, and they removed from public discussion legal and regulatory options that might have tempered some of the technology's ill effects. Stevens's hands-off-the-net decree continued to hold sway. Just a few months after The Wealth of Networks was published, Facebook unveiled the news feed. The four forces were now fully unleashed. Content assessment, filtering, and distribution would be done by privately controlled, centrally run software algorithms. The democratization story would go on being told, if with ever more caveats and qualifications, but it was now clear that the Internet's evolution as a communication medium was heading down a very different path. The Skeptic. A few days after Franz Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo, as European diplomacy collapsed into a welter of contentious telegraph and telephone messages, the young American journalist Walter Lippmann, fresh out of Harvard, brimming with radical ideas, and working on the launch of a progressive political magazine to be called The New Republic, boarded a ship for a summer holiday in Europe. After a month's stay in England, where he attended a bucolic Lake District Symposium on Socialism organized by George Bernard Shaw, he crossed the Channel to Brussels and, as he later recalled, bought a ticket for a journey through Germany to Switzerland, where I meant to spend my vacation walking over mountain passes. He remained totally unconscious of the political tensions rising around him, even as the shooting began. I remember being astonished and rather annoyed when I went to the railroad station and found that the German border was closed. Lippmann made it back to the United States safely, and that fall the New Republic started publishing on schedule to wide acclaim. The magazine took a neutral, isolationist stance toward the war, in line with prevailing liberal views. Lippmann, though, was shaken both by the conflict and by his obliviousness to its imminence. He found himself questioning his understanding of the world. The picture of it that he held in his mind, he realized, did not match what was actually there. He was overcome, he wrote, by a nausea of ideas. As reports of the European carnage grew more dire, his antipathy toward foreign entanglements dissolved, along with his pacifism. After German submarines began sinking civilian ships, including the crowded British ocean liner Lusitania, he became convinced that America had to side with England and France. In the spring of 1917, just weeks after President Woodrow Wilson gave in to political pressure and declared war on Germany, Lippmann announced, to the shock of his colleagues, that he was leaving the magazine to become an assistant to Wilson's Secretary of War, Newton Baker. A year later, having been given the rank of captain in the U.S. Army, he sailed back to Europe as a military intelligence agent, with orders to bolster the Allied propaganda campaign. In London, he participated in meetings where plans for the manipulation of public opinion were hashed out. Then, from an office near the Western Front in France, he used his literary skills to write leaflets urging German soldiers to desert, with promises of compassionate treatment and ample American-style meals of beef, white bread, potatoes, prunes, coffee, milk, and butter. Dropped onto the battlefield by the hundreds of thousands from balloons and planes, the leaflets were considered a great success. Surrendering German troops were often found to be carrying them when they were taken to prison camps. When Lippmann returned home after the war, his old optimism was gone, reports his biographer, Ronald Steele. His participation in the overseas propaganda effort, combined with his own early misconceptions about the war, left him with deep doubts about the human mind's objectivity and stability. His unease was magnified by the success of the Wilson administration's domestic propaganda campaign. Led by an ambitious Denver journalist and sometime politician named George Creel, the government's Committee on Public Information brought together writers, artists, filmmakers, and celebrities, along with some 75,000 local volunteers, in a well-funded effort to promote national pride, demonize the enemy, and squelch dissenting views. The goal, as Creel put it in his memoir, How We Advertised America, was to use all the tools of media, the printed word, the spoken word, the motion picture, the telegraph, the cable, the wireless, the poster, the signboard, to weld the people of the United States into one white-hot mass instinct. It succeeded. Turning propaganda into a form of entertainment, the campaign didn't just unify the country, it stoked jingoistic passions and prejudices. Mobs tarred and feathered opponents of the war and beat up German immigrants. In 1919, Lippmann wrote a despairing essay in the Atlantic Monthly titled The Basic Problem of Democracy. Democracy's founding ideal, that of a well-informed citizenry capable of making reasoned judgments about national problems and plans, had come into being in a much simpler time, he argued, when most concerns were local and people had direct experience of them. The assumptions of America's founders, a small, insular, largely agrarian elite, held little relevance to the bustling modern world, with its urban and industrial energies and lightning-quick communications. Society was much more complex now, and people's sense of it came not from their own first-hand observations, but through information received at second, third, or fourth hand. The public's understanding of social and political issues was fated to be incomplete, distorted, and easily manipulated. The world about which each man is supposed to have opinions has become so complicated as to defy his powers of understanding, Lippmann wrote. News comes at a distance. It comes helter-skelter in inconceivable confusion. It deals with matters that are not easily understood. It arrives and is assimilated by busy and tired people. The democratic citizen must seize catchwords and headlines or nothing. He expanded his argument in the 1922 book Public Opinion, a seminal treatise on social psychology that the communications scholar James Carey would later call the founding book in American media studies. Before Lippmann's work, democratic theory assumed that freedom, information, and the public good were tied together in a mutually reinforcing system. Carey summed up the logic. If people are free, they will have perfect information. If they have perfect information, they can be rational in choosing the most effective means to their individual ends, and if so, in a manner never quite explained, the social good will result. It was a nice theory, Lippmann wrote in Public Opinion, but a fantasy. It ignored the complexity of the world, and it ignored the perversity of human psychology. The environment in which we live, the real environment, is altogether too big, too complex, and too fleeting for direct acquaintance, Lippmann argued. To act in that environment, we have to reconstruct it on a simpler model. Drawing on whatever information is available to us and filtering it through our own desires and biases, each of us creates a mental pseudo-environment, a simplified and necessarily fictionalized picture of reality, and then we fit our thoughts and actions to the mirage's contours. Depending on the individual and his or her education, and personality, the pseudo-environment can take the form of anything from a complete hallucination to a scientific schematic model, but it is never a true and full picture of reality. This is the reason, Lippmann suggested, that the beliefs and behavior of others often seem so mysterious to us. People all live in the same world, but they think and feel in different ones. It is also why we're so susceptible. I want to underline that. That's a pretty good line there. People all live in the same world, but they think and feel in different ones. And that's Walter Lippmann's, he's quoting Walter Lippmann there. It is also, I say underline, I want to highlight it, actually. That's why I did. It is also why we're so susceptible to attempts to modify our sense of reality by manipulating the information we receive. What is propaganda, Lippmann wrote, if not the effort to alter the picture to which men respond, to substitute one social pattern for another? We construct our pseudo-environment out of what Lippmann termed stereotypes. When confronted by the great blooming, buzzing confusion of the outer world, we have to rely on rules of thumb, intuitive judgments, and other mental shortcuts, heuristics, as cognitive psychologists call them, to make sense of things. We comprehend through tuition rather than we comprehend through intuition rather than analysis, quickly fitting new phenomena into familiar patterns. We see the world in stereotyped shapes, derived from our moral codes and our social philosophies and our political agitations, as well as the cultural symbols supplied by art, literature, and entertainment. The more distracted we are, the more rapid and shallow our processing of information becomes, and the more we depend on stereotypes. Even in those rare moments when we're granted the luxury of deep thought, our focus is necessarily narrow. We can't think deeply about everything. So even the most thoughtful among us rely mainly on stereotypes in constructing a picture of the world. There is economy in this, Lippmann noted, anticipating the discovery psychologists would make about System 1 thinking and its reliance on shortcuts. For the attempt to see things freshly and in detail rather than as types and generalities is exhausting, and among busy affairs practically out of the question. As we grow older and more set in our opinions and routines, the stereotypes become all the more powerful as filters of reality. We imagine most things before we experience them, and our preconceptions govern deeply the whole process of perception. An unattainable ideal. Lippmann had his own pseudo-environment, of course. Oops. Sorry about that. Lippmann had his own pseudo-environment, of course, his own set of stereotypes. He was guilty at times of overreaching. He underestimated the public's ability, even with imperfect information and mismatched views of reality, to muddle through. And the solution he offered at the end of his book, a bureaucracy of experts that would guide governmental decision-making while remaining unsullied by politics, seems like its own kind of pipe dream. But public opinion is a brave and psychologically astute work. With a cold yet sympathetic eye, Lippmann looks beyond the ideal citizen of democratic theory, sovereign and omnicompetent, in his memorable phrase, to bring into focus the real person, time-strapped and distracted, biased, susceptible to resentment and sentimentality, bombarded with messages and images, overstretched, wavering between confusion and overconfidence. Lippmann would come to be attacked and dismissed as an anti-democratic elitist. But in painting his portrait of the average citizen, he was also, as he made clear in his next book, 1925's The Phantom Public, Lippmann would come to be attacked and dismissed as an anti-democratic elitist. But in painting his portrait of the average citizen, he was also, as he made clear in his next book, 1925's The Phantom Public, offering a self-portrait. Quote, "My sympathies are with him, for I believe that he has been saddled with an impossible task, and that he is asked to practice an unattainable ideal. I find it so myself, for although public business is my main interest, and I give most of my time to watching it, I cannot find time to do what is expected of me in the theory of democracy. That is, to know what is going on and to have an opinion worth expressing on every question which confronts a self-governing community. And I have not happened to meet anybody, from a president of the United States to a professor of political science, who came anywhere near to embodying the accepted ideal of the sovereign and omnicompetent citizen." End quote. Lippmann was not arguing that the public is stupid or incompetent. One of his central points, as the historian of journalism Michael Schudson emphasizes, is that a capacity for democratic self-government has nothing to do with native gray matter, but with the insufficiencies all of us share, a limited ability to attend to matters beyond our everyday experience. Lippmann remained committed to liberty and democracy, even as he lost faith, Schudson writes, in utopian aspirations for the role of the public as a participant in democratic decision-making on a daily basis. The ideal of the fully informed citizen isn't an undesirable ideal, Lippmann wrote. It is an unattainable ideal, but only in the sense that it is bad for a fat man to try to be a ballet dancer. Lippmann's work anticipates the critique of the rational decision-maker, the theoretical homo economicus of classical economics, that would be launched by social and cognitive psychologists later in the century. In a series of articles in the 1950s, the political scientist and future Nobel laureate Herbert Simon argued that the model individual of theory, the man who has knowledge of the relevant aspects of his environment, which, if not absolutely complete, is at least impressively clear and voluminous, was in need of an overhaul. Because human rationality is always constrained or bounded by limitations of knowledge, foresight, skill, and time, people have to construct mental simplifications of the real world for purposes of choice. Acknowledging Lippmann's work as an antecedent to his own, Simon emphasized that people's bounded rationality shapes and distorts their political choices as much as their economic ones. Simon drew mainly on common sense in making his argument. In the 1950s, little empirical research existed on how people form opinions and make decisions, but that lack was soon remedied. Cognitive psychologists and social scientists, including Daniel Kahneman and his longtime collaborator Amos Tversky, would over the ensuing decades conduct myriad experiments and studies revealing how human perception and thought are skewed by all sorts of cognitive biases and misperceptions. It isn't just that rationality is bounded in the everyday making of judgments and decisions. Rationality is often absent altogether. Our intuition is always telling us stories about the world, and even when they diverge sharply from reality, we're eager to believe them. The assumption of an efficient marketplace of ideas rests on the ideal of a rational consumer of ideas. A homo philosophicus, who, like his cousin Economicus, turns out to be a fictional character. A related line of research into how people form political opinions and cast votes has reached similar conclusions. Looking back on more than a half-century of opinion surveys and voter research in their 2016 book, Democracy for Realists, the political scientist Christopher Achen, A-C-H-E-N, however you pronounce that, and Larry Bartels report that the folk theory of democracy, which celebrates the wisdom of popular judgments by informed and engaged citizens, has long been contradicted by the facts. The political belief systems of ordinary citizens are generally thin, disorganized, and ideologically incoherent. Giving another nod to Lippmann, they conclude that conventional democratic ideas amount to fairy tales. As for the rather small set of voters who spend a lot of time reading, thinking, and talking about politics, the research reveals that their heightened engagement rarely broadens their minds. They're actually the ones most inclined to narrow and fervent partisanship. The more news they gobble up, the more convinced they are that they're right and anyone with a different view is wrong. As Zach Gershberg and Sean Illing report in their 2022 study, The Paradox of Democracy, the most knowledgeable voters, the ones who pay the most attention to politics, are also the ones most prone to biased or blinkered decision-making. A similar effect is seen with educational achievement. The more educated people are, the more distorted is their understanding of the views of their political opponents. That seems to be particularly true of Democrats, according to an extensive 2019 study of American political polarization. The apparent reason is that well-educated Democrats go to great lengths to avoid fraternizing with Republicans. As Democrats become more educated, their friend groups become less politically diverse, the authors of the study write. They restrict their social set to versions of themselves. In sum, the most highly engaged, active, and educated people are least accurate in their views of those they disagree with. Well before the net came along, I take exception to that, not only as a Democrat, but as a rational thinking human being. I think Republicans have just as distorted a view. Many of them also tend to stick with their tribe and not fraternize with anyone who disagrees with them. And then they demonize all Democrats as with stereotypes, with the most radical labels possible. So I do take exception to him singling out Democrats like that, or the study that he cites singling out Democrats. I don't think that's fair. Well before the net came along, the psychological, and I'm going to highlight that just to remind myself when we discuss this in book club next week, to make that comment. The more educated people are, he says, the more distorted is their understanding of the views of their political opponents. I vehemently disagree with that. Well before the net came along, the psychological and psephological, I do not know this word, Psephological, psephological. I'll have to look it up later. Was telling us that flooding the public square with more information from more sources was not going to open people's minds or engender more thoughtful discussions. It wasn't even going to make people better informed. Despite the revolutionary expansion in the public's access to information of all sorts, contemporary surveys clearly show that, as the political scientist Donald Kinder puts it, Americans are no better informed on public affairs than they were a generation or two ago. So what exactly was media democratization going to accomplish in terms of the country's political life? We now know the answer. It was going to widen the gap between the pseudo-environments in which people think and the real environment in which they act. This helps explain, among many other things, how a bare-chested man with a horned fur hat, a painted face, and a spear came to be bellowing on the floor of the U.S. Senate on the afternoon of January 6, 2021. Repeaters. Every group of people is also, as Charles Cooley pointed out, a social medium, a flesh and blood network for the transmission of influence. Because human beings are copycats by nature, to be human is to imitate, writes the British psychologist Susan Blackmore. Information tends to flow through groups in what researchers call a snowball process, or a cascade. One person makes a claim about a subject. Another person, lacking personal knowledge of the subject, accepts the claim as true and repeats it. Then another person repeats it, then another, and another, and another. The more people in the group who subscribe to the claim, the more compelling it becomes to everyone else in the group. Even skeptics get carried along. The claim becomes a belief, and the belief becomes a marker of group identity. Holding it becomes a social norm. As informational cascades continue to pour through the group, its members converge on a homogeneous set of beliefs, regardless of whether the beliefs are true, half true, or not true at all. Groups come to share the same pseudo-environment. In Cooley's day, informational cascades were more like trickles. Information moved slowly. Sharing it took time and effort. There were no like buttons on books or articles, no forward or reply all commands for the mail. You couldn't retweet a handwritten note. Today, with the frictionless sharing of computerized media, cascades can begin anywhere, and they can crisscross crisscross a country or the entire globe in a matter of hours, if not minutes. As Sunstein presently wrote in Republic.com, cascades become more likely when information, including false information, can be spread to hundreds, thousands, or even millions by the simple press of a button. And because social media encourages and facilitates group formation, making it easy for people to discover like-minded others and band together to exchange information, cascades within groups, what Sunstein calls local cascades, become more common and more polarizing. When group members find and circulate new bits of information that confirm a shared belief, the belief gets fortified, and following the well-documented dynamics of group polarization, becomes steadily more extreme. In a balkanized speech market, Sunstein observed, local cascades lead people in dramatically different directions. Groups stop listening to one another. Such factionalism and the intolerance it breeds further stunts online discussions by fueling the moralistic vigilantism known as cancel culture. There is only one correct view, our view, and anyone who says otherwise needs to be silenced. If, following Cooley, you think of a group as a mechanism of communication, a machine made of people, then an informational cascade can be understood as a means of amplifying a signal through repetition. The most shared messages become the loudest messages. Communication networks have always employed electronic repeaters to strengthen the power and reach of a signal. Analog telephone networks used arrays of transistors to boost the strength of a signal's current in the line. Over-the-air radio networks used relay repeaters to amplify signals by rebroadcasting them. Today, fiber optic data networks use phototransmitters to intensify the pulses of light that carry digital signals. In a social medium, human beings become the repeater. In a social medium, human beings become the repeaters. They boost, they rebroadcast, they amplify. It's a job that we humans, with our exquisite sensitivity to social signals, are extraordinarily well suited to. Claude Shannon had assumed that the goal of the network engineer was to remove redundancy from communication without sacrificing its comprehensibility. The assumption reflected the capacity constraints that had always characterized communication networks. You had to prune what was communicated in order to squeeze everything through a narrow pipe. Remove the capacity constraints and an inversion takes place. The goal is no longer to reduce redundancy, but to increase it, to send the same signal over and over again in order to increase its influential power. While attentional and temporal constraints push people to condense the messages they send online, the lack of constraints on network capacity encourages them to share messages promiscuously. When a message gets repeated in a social medium, it not only gets stronger as an informational signal, able to reach more people more quickly, it gets more meaningful to those who receive it. It assumes more importance, gains more salience in the mind. It comes to feel more true, even if it's false. The more frequently people are exposed to a message, an observation, an opinion, a lie, the more likely they are to accept its validity. Repetition is, in the human mind, a proxy for facticity. This psychological phenomenon, first described in a 1977 journal article and confirmed in myriad studies since, is known as the illusory truth effect. As a group of brain scientists explained in a 2023 article in the journal Cognition, a vast literature suggests that repeated statements are perceived as more accurate, even when the statements are from non-credible sources. End quote. Hearing a false statement once makes you considerably more likely to believe it the next time you hear it, even if you were originally dubious about it. Hearing it a third time makes it even more believable. And as soon as you sense it's true, you're more likely to repeat the statement to others, expanding the effect. As the Cognition authors, who verified the phenomenon in an online setting through 2 experiments of their own, concluded, repeated exposure to misinformation is likely to create a vicious circle in which misinformation would be perceived as true and therefore shared more. Familiarity may breed contempt when it comes to judging people, but when it comes to judging information, it breeds gullibility. If social media has an intellectual creed, it is a creed of repetition, the creed of the mob, the huckster, and the tyrant. Endless repetition, Victor Klemperer observed of the Nazis as they took power in 1933, appears to be one of the stylistic features of their language. The unending competition to produce messages that will get repeated, that will propagate through the network, is a battle for meaning as well as influence. In the absence of editorial controls on quality, of either the centralized variety of old or the decentralized variety imagined by Binkler, the information about the world that spreads through online cascades skews toward the biased, the exaggerated, and the fake. Real facts tend to be mundane and drab. Leaving the emotions uncharged, they stream by without making much of an impression on the nervous system. Falsehoods are constructed to be novel and surprising, exciting and infuriating. They grab attention. They get shared. When human beings serve as the repeaters in a communication network, when they take on a signal amplification role, while still acting in their traditional roles as creators and interpreters of messages, Shannon's distinction between mechanism and meaning gets shakier still. Meaning becomes a network effect. What's true is what comes out of the machine most often. When Twitter was founded in early 2006, it didn't have a retweet button. Early users would regularly repost others' tweets, but they had to do the sharing manually. They'd cut and paste the text of another user's post into a new tweet of their own, type the initials RT at the front of it, along with the original poster's Twitter handle, then hit tweet. It took a minute or two, which in the bustle of social media came to seem a burden. In 2009, Twitter's founders, belatedly realizing that retweeting had become a popular activity on the platform, hired a former Google programmer named Chris Wetherell to automate the process, and the retweet button soon made its debut. It was a hit. With retweeting now easier and quicker, the volume of retweets soared. Wetherell did what coders always do. He used software to make a commonplace but cumbersome process more efficient. John Vital had accomplished something very similar years earlier when he created email's forward and reply functions. A series of steps became a single command, an effortless click in the case of the retweet button. When his creation went live, Wetherell felt a sense of pride, he recalled in a later interview with BuzzFeed. Not only was he relieving people of a small nuisance, he was doing his part to democratize media. Making it easier for people to share tweets would, he assumed, bring more voices into the conversation. The unheard would get heard. We put power in the hands of the people, is what he told himself at the time. He was right, but the way people wielded that power was different from what he expected. As is often the case with automation, the new software feature not only sped up a routine activity, it changed people's behavior, even their attitudes. The time and effort required to share a tweet manually, though seemingly so small as to be inconsequential, turned out to be vitally important. It slowed people down. It gave them a moment to reconsider the message they were about to repeat, now under their own name. Once that little bit of friction was removed, people acted and reacted more impulsively. Twitter became more frenzied, more partisan, and much nastier. The whole system started to go haywire, wrote the prominent technology journalist Alexis Madrigal. While the retweet button was used benignly in many cases, and did sometimes direct attention to worthy ideas that might otherwise have gone unseen, it also became a bludgeon. It was used to spread lies, to coordinate personal attacks on individuals, and to demonize political opponents. It proved an ideal means for rallying partisan or vindictive mobs. The notorious Gamergate scandal, in which bizarre conspiracy theories led to a vicious campaign of harassment against female programmers and gamers, was fueled largely by retweets. Dismayed by what his innovation had wrought, Wetherell changed his view about democratization. We might have just handed a 4-year-old a loaded weapon, he now worried. But the retweet button proved good for business. As Facebook had found with the outraged reaction to its news feed, the controversy and anger provoked by barrages of retweets galvanized Twitter's audience. People may have now felt soiled after their Twitter sessions, but they enjoyed the mud wrestling. Engagement went up. Stream checking became a compulsion. Journalists and politicians rushed into the fray, opening Twitter accounts with dreams of having their own remarks sweep the network. And as with Facebook's like button, the retweet button generated valuable data for Twitter. It provided a moment-by-moment readout on topics and posts that provoked and captivated readers. Fed back into the company's filtering algorithm, the data further stoked engagement. The retweet button also proved a boon to advertisers who could now compose their promotional messages in ways likely to generate bursts of free publicity. Not long after Twitter introduced the retweet button, Facebook rolled out an automated sharing button of its own. By 2010, with news feeds and sharing buttons in place, with filtering algorithms dispensing personalized content, with users shifting from websites to mobile apps, social media had matured as a mechanism of communication and as a business. The major platforms now look to their users, the general public, to play three roles. On the supply end of the network, they worked as content producers, churning out endless streams of posts and comments that provided the platforms with enormous quantities of engaging content for free. In the middle of the network, within the mechanism, they played the role of repeaters, boosting traffic by amplifying the most compelling messages and in the process divulging valuable data about themselves. Finally, on the network's demand end, they played the more traditional role of audience members, though now the content they received was tightly geared to their individual tastes and biases. The users didn't need to be pulled into these roles against their will. They took to them naturally. All right, this has gone on for more than an hour. I'm going to stop now. I have about 10 pages left in this chapter. So we'll stop here with this session. In the next session, we will finish chapter 6, the democratization fallacy of Nicholas Carr's book, Superbloom, How Technologies of Connection Tear Us Apart. Thank you. Thank you for watching.